I'm still trying to recreate every Apex Legends character as a LEGO minifigure. So far I've done Lifeline, Octane, Bloodhound, Ash, Watson, Revenant, Vantage, Lifeline again, and Crypto. And at the end of the last video, a few months ago, the wheel decided that the next character to do is Gibby. Gibraltar, Caustic, and Revenant were the three characters I was dreading most when I started this project. Revenant for obvious reasons, but the main problem with the other two is that they are just so much larger than the other legends. I was tempted to go the way of Reinhardt and just ignore their larger size and just print on a regular figure, but that felt lazy, so ultimately I decided to do what LEGO did with Wrecker and the Dark Troopers and bulk the figure up with a chest piece that has the torso details printed onto it. So I went into Mechabricks and decided on this combination of torso pieces, so I could use this one for the collar and this one for the rest of the chest. I also decided on this hair piece, which was pretty much perfect, and this classic shield piece, which I could also print onto later. Nothing too crazy. The face print was really smooth sailing because I realized the episode 2 Anakin minifigure, which I had access to as a reference, had pretty much the perfect smirk for Gibraltar in the reference image. From there I needed to change the color of the skin to I think a medium nougat, which also involved changing the color of the skin creases to I think reddish brown. I added some bottom eyelids to the print, making sure that one eye is more opened than the other because that's how it looked in the reference. I also shifted his eyebrows down and around to finish off the expression before adding some more face details in the way of a brow crease and some lines for his temple ridges. I was really happy with how this face turned out because usually with these characters they have some defining feature on the face which acts as a crutch in the sense that you'd be able to recognize the character by that detail alone. For example, the veins on Watson's face, the metal shards on Crypto, the piercings on Astra, and the grey lines on Vantage, so you didn't really need to capture the likeness too much beyond that for them to work, but Gibraltar doesn't have any unique features like that, so I really needed to get the face to look like him, and I actually think just the temple ridge printing kind of accomplished that perfectly, so that was pretty cool. The next step was to pose him. This wasn't too difficult because mercifully he has a pretty simple pose. The shield piece was too big for him I think, so I scaled it down a little bit so it worked better with the figure. I know I mentioned in the Watson video that scaling down accessory pieces like that was kinda cringe, but I figured it didn't matter too much here since it's a standalone accessory and not a brick built creation. It's whatever, who cares. The next step was doing the right leg print. Here I decided to print the flap of his shirt onto the legs directly as opposed to adding a cloth material because it's much easier this way. There's way too much detail to print or sew onto a piece of fabric. I think it'll just look better this way, and most importantly, without it, Gibraltar has almost nothing going on with his legs, like he's just wearing grey pants pretty much. This way, it'd at least make them more interesting to look at. This was actually a recurring problem with these leg prints, because while all the details and colours for the flap and pouch were handy enough, the rest of the leg is all the same shade of grey. And for a custom minifigure, it looked awful to have all these details printed with the black lines and have that be it. I couldn't add any shading because the base colour of the pants was the darker grey, and there's no midway point between that colour and black, and there's no opportunity to add any accent colours or anything like that because it's all just grey. I ended up taking some absurd creative liberties with it, and ended up colouring the leg print with a lighter shade of grey. It's blatantly sacrificing accuracy for the sake of looking better, but my god, it just looked terrible doing it the other way, so it was the best thing I could think of to do with it. Left leg print was just a copy paste and horizontal flip job. As usual, changed a few details here and there to not make it perfectly symmetrical, but that's about the extent of it. Now the next step was finishing off the shirt flap by adding the detail to the crotch area of the legs. I intentionally left a gap in the detail when doing the leg prints so it could be filled in here and look proper. This actually wasn't as difficult as I thought it would be. I did some trial and error to figure out the scale, but from there it was just extending the rest of the print, which wasn't too hard. I think this level of fine printing is definitely way above what LEGO would or probably could ever do because of how tiny these details are, but I didn't want to skimp on these patterns because they look really cool and it'd be a shame not to include them. Now extending these details into the waist print was actually a problem because while I left enough horizontal detail out of the leg prints so they could extend into the crotch, I did not do that with the vertical details, so I actually ran out of pattern to fill the gap. So I had to improvise and just kind of make up a pattern that looked like it was a continuation. I think I went too symmetrical with the middle part, but it did the trick I think. I also redrew the buckle details on each side because in the posed figure they disappeared under the waist piece, so I just redid them so they could be seen. Next was the torso print, and this needs some explanation. I knew I needed to print the torso details onto the Mechabrick accessories, but I didn't have a UV map to do so. So I knew I'd just have to draw the torso details onto the render in Photoshop. When you render something in Blender that has a custom print on it, there is a slight difference in the color values of the prints on the render when compared to the same UV map in Photoshop. So what I did here is take all the colors I thought I'd need, plonked them onto a torso piece, and then had two torso prints rendered alongside the figure at slightly different angles. The idea being that when I'm doing the final adjustments, and thus adding the torso details, I could swatch from these rendered colors and achieve a more realistic look. This all turned out to be completely pointless because I ended up just coloring using the color palette in Photoshop and just experimenting with the blending modes. You live and learn, I guess. Can't fault me for trying. So then came the final Photoshop adjustments. Now the first thing I needed to do was fix the collar area to match the reference. This wasn't too difficult. I may have gotten the lighting wrong looking at it now, but I don't think you'd notice it at a glance, especially with the orange detail on it. Then I needed to flatten out the chest torso piece so it was just a flat, blank canvas. This was obviously needed because the piece I had used has all these ridges and textures that were totally inaccurate and impossible to print onto properly when you consider the shadows they cast. Doing that took a while, but my next step was actually printing the details onto it. I started with the dividing line between the torso and the shoulder pad, and honestly I kind of wish I went with straight shoulder printing and a sleeveless chest piece because it's kind of hard to tell what this is, but oh well. From there I just drew everything to the best of my ability. This was really difficult because of the colour blending and the angle that the figure was standing at. Truthfully, I think I biffed the scaling of the print a bit because my brain was applying some perspective scaling to the parts of the print further away, which doesn't really make sense because it would be a 2D print. Like, look at the pouch on the left compared to the right. This print should be the same size if we're looking at it straight on, because it would be a 2D image, and the only difference in scale should come from the extremely slight angle the torso is at compared to the camera. But instead, I made it noticeably smaller. Again, looks fine from this angle, but try to imagine you were looking at this print from the other side, and suddenly it doesn't look so right. And finally, I needed to add the print to the shield. This was just straight up ridiculous levels of cheating. I added a print pretty much everywhere around each stud on this thing. I think it looks good, which is ultimately the goal, but I definitely think it needed more space around the studs in hindsight. I added some highlights to the print, changed the blending mode, and called it a day. And there you go, the final figure. Not perfectly accurate, and I cheated a lot to get there, but man, I'm just happy Gibraltar's finished now. And now let's see who's next. It's only Caustic now that I'm dreading, for the same reasons as Gibby, so let's see. Oh, for fuck's sake.